Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the fourth in our four-part series for April is Fair Housing Month. This week's webinar is entitled Accessible Design and Construction Requirements for Apartments. My name is James Campbell, and I'm the Senior Manager of Industry Relations with NAA. I want to welcome all of our members in attendance. Thank you for joining us. For this presentation, we wish to alert you to VSTO's Professional Fair Housing Program of courses. The URL is featured below. We also wish to alert you to NAA's Click and Lease and Click and Comply programs for all your leasing and building maintenance compliance needs. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping points. First, this presentation is being recorded and will be posted to our website and YouTube channel next week. You may then share this presentation with those colleagues and friends who are unable to attend at present. Second, we have allotted time at the end of today's presentation for live questions and answers, but you may also type your questions into the Q&A or chat boxes on your screen at any time during our presentation. Next, a brief disclaimer that the information provided in this presentation does not and is not intended to constitute legal advice. Instead, all content provided is for general informational purposes only. With that, let me turn things over to Nicole Apano, NAA's Assistant Vice President for Housing Policy and Regulatory Affairs. Nicole?
Wonderful. Thank you, James. So welcome, everyone, and I'm very pleased to be with all of you today. We're commemorating the 55th anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act and closing our Fair Housing Month webinar series with some esteemed speakers. As James said, I'm Nicole Upano. I'm AVP of Housing Policy and Regulatory Affairs for NAA, and I'll be moderating today's session. So allow me a few minutes just to introduce our speakers before we get into the meat of our program. So today I'm joined on the virtual stage by Scott Moore, who is a partner at Baird Holm and the author of NAA's Accessible Design and Construction Toolkit. Scott is a recognized national expert in the Americans with Disabilities Act and fair housing law. He served as legal specialist for HUD's Fair Housing Accessibility First program and now represents property managers, developers, design professionals in all aspects of fair housing and accessibility. I'm honored to have HUD's Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, Ms. Demetria McCain. PDAS McCain has 15 years of experience helping to eliminate housing discrimination, promote economic opportunity, and achieve diverse, equitable, and inclusive communities. As part of her illustrious career, Ms. McCain served as president of the Inclusive Communities Project, a Dallas-based nonprofit where prior to becoming president, she oversaw operations, communications, and ICP's mobility assistance programs, which are dedicated to helping housing choice voucher holders and their families. So from here, I'd love to turn the floor over to our special guest and ask Ms. McCain to give remarks.
Thank you so much, Nicole. PDAS, it's quite a long title, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary. We shorten it as much as we can. Thank you for inviting me, James. Thank you for inviting me, Nicole. It's great to be here, particularly as we are 3 days away from closing out the 55th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, Fair Housing Month. So I appreciate, this is my last formal speaking engagement during Fair Housing Month. So it's great to be here with you. And I actually send greetings from Secretary Marcia L. Fudge, who leads us over here at HUD. Now, as you may know, our office's mission is to eliminate housing discrimination, promote economic opportunity, and as was stated, achieve diverse, inclusive communities. And let me just say that I am actually encouraged to see today that you guys are focusing on accessibility. You know, since I took on this role at HUD, I've actually had the opportunity to meet with a number of stakeholders with disabilities, and I have a growing appreciation for the importance of civil rights laws that we have that aim to ensure equal opportunity for all, no matter their levels of ability. At HUD, here, we focus on enforcement, and we enforce and implement a number of laws, including but not limited to the Fair Housing Act, which we're celebrating today, but also Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And I'll just put a footnote there that the 50th anniversary of that's coming up. And also the ADA. All of these in order to ensure that disability rights are recognized, not just in writing, but recognized in practice and in reality. When discussing disability rights and protections, it's important to remember intersectionality. I just want to mention that too, because people with disabilities are not a monolith, right? People with disabilities also can fall into other protected class. There are 7, right? There's race, color, national origin, religion, sex, including gender identity, sexual orientation, familial status, and disability. And so sometimes they face discrimination on a number of fronts. So just want to highlight a few things for you today that we've seen in our office. Disability discrimination might look like this. It might look like a housing authority failing to properly monitor its subrecipient housing providers who fail to process, but instead delayed reasonable accommodation requests, as well as fail to properly record those requests. Or it might look like a landlord refusing to rent to a mother and her daughter because of her daughter's cerebral palsy. It might also look like a condo company refusing to waive a rule limiting occupants to 2 persons per bedroom to allow a family of 8, one of whom was a young child having a bone marrow transplant at a nearby hospital, to temporarily rent the 3-bedroom unit when they need to live together to facilitate the young child's medical treatment and care. And it might look like that very same condo levying a monthly fine against the unit's owner because of the family's occupancy of that condo. And it might look like a housing provider failing to design and construct an 84-unit building in accordance with the Fair Housing Act's requirements for accessible housing. These are just a few of the examples of the types of complaints that our office, FHEO, hears way too often. Actually, in fiscal year 2021, FHEO received over 11,000 complaints. Of those 11,000, disability ranks as the one that we see the most, with race being second. And with the time that I have with you this afternoon, I'd like to highlight a few actions that the Biden-Harris administration is taking in order to root out housing discrimination on the basis of disability. So very much this week, hot off the presses, I want you to know that HUD is reviewing Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in any program or activity that receives federal funds from HUD. HUD has not updated its Section 504 regs in a really long time, actually since 1988. Maybe some people on this call weren't even born at that time. Since 1988, the percentage of the US population of individuals with disabilities has increased and it's diversified. And since 1988, HUD has observed significant changes in building practices and technology since that time. I'm sure some of you would attest to that. So like I said, just this week, we published an advance notice of proposed rulemaking as it relates to Section 504 regulations. This advance notice acknowledges the need to align HUD's Section 504 regs with environmental, societal, and technological advances and some emerging issues. And the purpose of this advance notice is to seek public comment from a wide variety of stakeholders on issues that actually will inform how we draft the regulation when it's rewritten. So that advance notice is currently online at hud.gov/504. And so that's just really one thing I wanted to get out to this community, since that just happened this week. Affirmatively furthering fair housing. Now, this Monday of this week, April 24th, the public comment period for the affirmatively for housing notice of proposed rulemaking closed. This proposed rule actually came out to really fully realize the mandate of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which, like I said, we're celebrating today. And so this mandate requires more than simply avoiding discrimination. It requires HUD and its program participants, which are public housing agencies, states, and localities that receive HUD funding, to proactively take meaningful actions to overcome patterns of segregation, promote fair housing choice, eliminate disparities and opportunities, including those for people with disabilities, and to foster inclusive communities free from discrimination. So HUD's affirmatively furthering fair housing proposed rule, once finalized, would implement the statutory mandate. And our website includes a recorded briefing that can explain a bit more, and that's at hud.gov/AFFH. Of course, this rule doesn't relate specifically to private industry, but it does speak to, like I said, housing agencies, it speaks to states, and it speaks to localities that receive HUD funding. But it looks at the whole community. So I think that's worth pointing out to you folks here. And just in case you're not aware, FHEO's regional staff remain ready to provide the technical assistance that one needs on an as-needed basis. And we do that regularly. But let me talk about two very specific tools that we have. The first program is the technical assistance program we have, in which I understand you'll be hearing more about in just a second. As you may know, the Fair Housing Act requires all newly constructed multifamily housing with 4 or more units to comply with accessible design and construction requirements, so that the housing is accessible to and adaptable for the use by people with disabilities, which prompted us to create the Fair Housing Accessibility First program, which provides information, technical assistance, resources, and training on the accessible design and construction requirements of the Fair Housing Act. Now, the program aims to arm the public and private owners and developers and architects, operators of housing like yourselves and others, with compliant practices to promote accessibility and avoid discrimination against people with disabilities. Because too often accessibility is an afterthought, leaving people with disabilities with just limited choice and no access to certain homes. And while the name of the program is FIRST, F-I-R-S-T, it serves actually as an acronym for the services that are offered, standing for Fair Housing, Information, Resources, Support, and Technical Assistance. It also indicates just how important it is to plan for accessibility first, before engineering, right? Before design, before construction. So there's just one more tool I'd like to touch on, which is a tool that's created by way of our guidance on marketing and application requirements for subsidized multifamily properties. And we issued that just last year. These two guidance documents provide practical advice to help property owners and managers reach all members of the community and ensure that housing is not segregated on the basis of race, color, or national origin, whether that person lives with or without a disability. And so the guidance informs housing providers about exclusionary practices to avoid, and inform housing providers about inclusionary practices to employ while they're trying to ensure meaningful opportunities for persons. So folks, just far too long, discrimination has kept people from stable, healthy, affordable homes on the basis of one or more of the protected classes under the Fair Housing Act. Home is where people have the ability to build a life of opportunity, to recover from illness, to search for a job, or maybe to raise a family. So we got to all do our part to make sure that people have equal opportunity. We can't do it alone. The federal government can't do it alone. I want to thank you for being our partners in this work, and I look forward to hearing all the wonderful things that Scott's going to talk to us about. So thanks for having me, folks.
Thank you so much, Demetria. We really appreciate you being here and providing those remarks, and we'll certainly pass along those resources to our folks that joined and who signed up for the webinar. From here, I would like to turn things over to Scott Moore to lead the rest of our program. Scott?
Well, good morning, afternoon, depending on where you're watching this morning. I'd like to thank PDS, we'll say, for the kind comments and the great insight in what HUD is doing in both enforcing and affirmatively furthering fair housing. Today, I want to take a few minutes to talk about the tools that NAA is offering to help compliance in this arena. And, you know, I always say that I've been trying for 25 years and I continue to try to work myself out of a job. And that is to get compliance, because what I found being sort of on both sides of the table here, working for the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department for 6 years, enforcing Fair Housing Act cases, and since then being a representative of the industry, is we all want to arrive at the same point. And that is, what are the accessibility requirements? Let's make sure they get incorporated from the very beginning in the most efficient and obviously cost-effective manner, and provide accessible housing for everyone. We're all on the same team here, regardless of who you are. And that's why I was very excited when Nicole first talked to me, and then we developed the toolkit from NAA. So this area of fair housing and discrimination, which it is, becomes very confusing from time to time, right? Where we have a barrage of laws that require accessibility and then code compliance law, both at the federal and state level. At the federal level, we have the Federal Fair Housing Act, along with the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and even those out there designing affordable housing who are getting funding from HUD have to think about Section 504, as the Principal Deputy Secretary talked about earlier. But also we have state and local laws. And historically in this industry, we've really leaned on those state and local laws to guide us, right? Those inspectors from the municipality are out inspecting our projects. They're looking at our plans, they're giving a stamp of approval. The problem is that doesn't help you comply with federal law. Because if there are differences, and often there are, between federal accessibility law and state law, those inspectors aren't inspecting for that, they're not looking for that. So that stamp of approval doesn't mean anything with regard to whether you've met the requirements. And so the focus that we have certainly done at NAA is to focus on multifamily residential construction and what the accessibility requirements are. And those principally are derived from the Federal Fair Housing Act, which requires multifamily housing, covered dwellings, that's housing with 4 or more units in a building, designed and constructed after March 13th of 1991, to have 7 basic features of design and constructed incorporated in the design and in the construction. When you sell that first unit or you begin renting that property, that accessibility is there, it's incorporated in the plans, it's incorporated in the design, it's incorporated in the construction when you roll it out. The ADA has a very little to do with what we talk about. Our rental offices certainly have to comply with the ADA, but when we're talking about accessible construction and residential housing, we're focusing on the Fair Housing Act, and that's where the toolkit focuses. If we could go to the next slide. So those laws we talk about are pretty general. Okay, if we could click one more time. If we could go one more time on this slide to bring up the language on the side, please. Thank you. Each of these laws that relate to accessibility have their own set of technical standards. So the laws will generally tell you we need these features, but the technical standards are really the nitty-gritty, where we get down to say, okay, when the law requires a usable door, how wide does that door have to be? Do we have to have accessible hardware that allows someone to open it? We know we have to have backing for grab bars, but where is that backing supposed to be? That's where we get into the technical standards. And those technical standards is really where we get to in the toolkit to make sure you understand completely what is required. If we could go to the next slide. I often say that ignoring accessibility compliance is like ignoring your car's engine. You'll be humming along fine until at some point you don't do the maintenance, you don't look at your property, and then all of a sudden, boom, the car breaks down. So in addition to that new construction we're concerned about, as we have properties, especially now, right, when we're, more than 20 years out from the coverage, the initial May 13th of 1991 coverage, as we're managing and owning these properties we may not have even built. We have to maintain that accessibility. So we have to know what's going on, right? When that rain or that snow or that thaw changes the slopes or pops up a curb, so we have an abrupt level change. Are we aware of that? Are we fixing that? Are we making sure we maintain that accessibility, right? The paint fades on our parking lot. So when we repaint that parking lot, do we have the proper dimensions of an accessible parking space with an access aisle? Do we have a van accessible space at our rental office where someone with a van can come up and use their lift to come down? Those things are always ongoing things, and it changes, especially over a 20-year period. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So that's why we have, and we really encourage everyone to look into the Fair Housing Act Accessibility Toolkit. Go ahead. We've designed this toolkit to be a comprehensive overview of the Fair Housing Act design and construction requirements. If we could please click through to add the other ones here. Go ahead and add all of them for the slide. It contains a detailed design and construction checklist with diagrams and photos of real life examples of what properties have looked like when they're compliant and when they're not compliant. We've seen thousands of units, and I've inspected or seen properties in most of the states and territories in the United States. I've even been over to Guam and Saipan in the Mariana Islands in the middle of the South Pacific addressing accessibility. We've seen a lot, and we've learned a lot with regard to common issues of design and construction. What do we know that people struggle with? We've included that in the toolkit to highlight those. We talk about the best practices. How do we get the entire team involved? Go ahead and click the rest of those. Best practices for property managers to make sure we're looking for and we're remedying ongoing accessibility issues. The most common misconceptions. I've never met someone that didn't want to comply with the law when it comes to accessibility. I've met a lot of people with misconceptions. Oh, I thought that was the ADA that made that. No, it's the Fair Housing Act. And let me explain why it's different. And then we talk about the enforcement process. How do these complaints arrive? Who can be sued? How do you respond when you get a complaint? What's the best way to respond to manage that problem? Go ahead. Here's some examples from the toolkit, right? The layperson may look at that photo on the left and say, oh, it looks good. You got a ramp there. Looks like you can skate through that with a wheelchair. Okay. But as you see the compliant side of things, significant changes to make that compliant, right? We had to relay the concrete to fix the sloping. We added a cane detectable barrier. Because of the steepness of that slope in between those cars, we had to add handrails. Those are the things that we miss that we need to see, and this toolkit helps us get there. Go ahead. Again, we also pull things directly out of the HUD design manual to make it very clear how HUD interprets these requirements with regard to where do you place environmental controls. These diagrams are helpful, so we not only is our architect understanding, but our team that's in the field installing these things understand. The first case I ever had, the architect didn't put the heights of the outlets and the light switches on there and said, that's not our practice in the community. Now, the court said, in the future, you have to do that. But because the contractor wasn't aware of where they need to be placed, they were all placed throughout the community out of compliance. Go ahead. And again, as I said, we're not just talking about design and construction, right? We're talking about that foresight when you're leasing properties, not only in the pre-construction, the construction, but the ongoing management. And how do we spot those issues and make housing accessible, and of course, avoid those complaints. Go ahead. And finally, we have a frequently asked questions section. We have learned over the past 25 years, I've certainly learned in my practice, what are those frequently asked questions? What do I get over and over again as I do my training throughout the year, as I advise clients, as I handle cases? What do I see commonly coming up, not just in the design, but in questions? How do we deal with this issue? Because accessibility is ultimately going to be, as Principal Deputy Secretary said, is going to be intertwined with other things. Accommodations, modifications, things that people may need in the accessibility realm when they move into a property that are over and above those minimum standards. And so we explore those, and we hope that you view this, and we think this is a comprehensive view of accessibility in residential construction, in property ownership and property management that you can rely on, that you can have for your desk reference every day. And we're very excited about this. I was so excited to be part of this. I was so honored to be part of this, to again, do what we all want to accomplish, making housing accessible. So I encourage you to look at our toolkit. Congratulations on a successful Fair Housing Month. And I look forward to seeing you in the future. And again, thank you everyone for including me in this presentation today.
Well, thank you so much, Scott, for all that great information. And certainly we hope that you can use NAA and the resources that PDAS McCain suggested to help you navigate through accessible design and construction requirements. So I don't see any questions at the moment, but wanted to pause for another minute to see if any folks had questions. Hearing and seeing none, I wanted to turn things back over to James Campbell for some closing remarks.
Well, terrific, Nicole. Thank you for that. And thank you to both PDAS McCain and to Scott Moore for this outstanding webinar. For additional fair housing resources, NAA maintains an online portal for especially relevant offerings for NAA members. The URL is featured below. And of course, these resources include the newly updated fair housing toolkits on both accessible design and construction, plus emotional support animals. They also include more than 30 fair housing courses hosted on our Visto platform. And there is another portal with additional fair housing resources such as legal explanations plus protections in state and local jurisdictions. That URL is featured below. And finally, if you've enjoyed today's webinar and would like to view more, you can always visit our YouTube channel for those many NAA webinars that are now viewable on demand. That URL is featured below. So again, I want to thank everyone for participating. Special thanks to our presenters, PDAS McCain and Scott Moore and Nicole Upano, and thank you as well to our audience. We value your membership and appreciate your attendance. Have a great afternoon.